body of an elderly woman was found on the kitchen floor. Her face was disfigured by blows from a heavy object. Blood had spread across the linoleum, soaking the cracks of the old covering. In the next room sat a teenager. He did not cry, did not call for help. His hands and clothes were covered in blood. His eyes were empty, as if what had happened was inevitable. When the police entered the house, the smell of metal and stale life hit their noses. This did not look like a random outburst of aggression or a quarrel. There was something bigger building here, something dark and pathological, which brought both of them to the end, where only blood and silence remained. The story of this family began as many biographies of residents of small American towns do. An ordinary house on a quiet street, a well-kept yard, good neighborly relations. In the center is a middle-aged couple and their only son. For those around them, they were an example of stability. They worked, provided for their child, participated in the life of the community. But this apparent stability was destroyed suddenly. The death of his parents was a turning point. The tragic accident deprived the boy of his father and mother almost simultaneously. For him, this meant not only the loss of his closest people, but also a complete change in his future. His grandmother, a woman of about 50, took on all the responsibilities for his upbringing. She was well known in the city. She worked most of her life in the service industry, was respected, had connections with the local church and organizations. There were no signs of deviations or scandals in her biography. A widow who managed to raise a daughter and keep order in the house. At first glance, she was the most suitable guardian for an orphan teenager. In the first months after the tragedy, her care seemed natural. She attended all school events, made sure her grandson did not lack food and clothing, and compensated for the absence of his parents with her attention for the social service and her friends. This looked like a model of selflessness. However, her involvement gradually began to go beyond the usual guardianship. She limited the teenager's social circle, insisting that meetings with friends distracted him from his studies and led to wrong thoughts. Her grandson increasingly found himself alone at home with her. If he stayed late after school, this caused her to have bouts of anxiety and irritation. Neighbors began to notice that the teenager rarely went out into the yard. If earlier he played with his peers or helped with the housework, now he spent almost all his time behind closed curtains. The grandmother explained this by the fact that he was having a hard time coping with the loss and was not ready to communicate. This version suited those around him because the situation seemed logical after such a tragedy. Over time, her behavior began to resemble obsessive control. She demanded detailed reports on every step, checked personal belongings, and limited the use of the phone. The teenager lived in a mode of constant surveillance. Any attempt to show independence was perceived by her as a threat. Researchers later noted that it was during this period that the conditions for pathological dependence began to form. The grandmother transferred all the energy that had previously been distributed between work, society, and her own life to her grandson. He became the center of her existence. The emotional burden on the teenager grew. He faced not only the trauma of his parents' death, but also pressure from his guardian. He had virtually no opportunity to seek help. There were few relatives, and those who remained did not intervene. Social services believed that the child was in good hands. The house gradually turned into a closed system where external connections disappeared. Any attempt to go beyond the framework of this system was blocked. Thus, a dependency circuit was formed from which the teenager had no way out. Over time, the grandmother's care ceased to be a protection and turned into an instrument of pressure. She no longer simply looked after the teenager, but completely determined his daily routine. Every hour was scheduled by her. Time to get up, eat, study. Even simple decisions, what clothes to wear, what to do after school, had to be agreed upon. At first, it looked like strict discipline. Her bereaved grandson seemed vulnerable to her, and so she justified her actions with concern. But the boundaries gradually blurred. He could not leave the house to visit his friends on his own. If he wanted to go for a walk or stay after school, his grandmother reacted violently, from tears to sudden outbursts of anger. Over time, her emotional reactions began to become more and more obsessive. She cried if he went out without warning, accused him of indifference and betrayal. On some occasions, she locked the doors, leaving him at home, explaining this out of concern for his safety. The teenager found himself isolated, not only from his peers, but also from other adults. Neighbors recalled that they saw him less and less. Sometimes he would stand by the window, watching the street, but he never dared to go out to the boys. His life became more and more closed, limited by the house and strict rules. At the same time, the grandmother increasingly demonstrated behavior that was uncharacteristic of normal family relationships. She spent long hours with him, closely watching his every move. Simply reading a book or doing homework was accompanied by her constant presence. She could sit next to him without being distracted, as if she was afraid of missing something important. For the teenager, this became a source of increasing pressure. He had no space for privacy, no opportunity to feel like a separate individual. His room, which could have been a place of solitude, was left open to constant visits. She controlled his sleep, could wake him at night under the pretext of caring for his health. Gradually, her behavior acquired signs of pathological fixation. She stopped seeing him as an independent person. Her grandson became the center around which her entire existence revolved. Her life narrowed. She almost stopped communicating with friends, rarely went out, paying attention only to the house and him. The teenager's internal tension grew. On the one hand, he felt guilty for not being able to live up to his grandmother's expectations. On the other hand, he understood that he was not capable of living under constant control. His attempts to resist only led to new outbursts of emotion from his guardian. Later, experts noted that at this stage, the first signs of emotional abuse began to form. The teenager was deprived of autonomy, freedom, and personal boundaries. The grandmother drew him deeper into dependence, from which he could not free himself. By his mid-teens, his social connections had all but disappeared. Teachers noted a decline in his grades, but attributed it to the stress of the family tragedy. No one saw the situation as a warning sign. The lack of outside intervention allowed the conditions for a future catastrophe to gradually develop within the home. The emotional closeness that the grandmother used to cover up her actions became increasingly intrusive and painful. It demanded full attention, excluding the possibility of sharing thoughts or feelings with others. Every step of the teenager was recorded. Every action was discussed. His existence turned into a regime of constant control and psychological pressure. As the teenager reached older age, the grandmother's control became even more intrusive and strange. If earlier her behavior could be explained by the fear of losing her grandson, now it began to resemble dependence with elements of pathological attachment. She increasingly demonstrated reactions that went beyond the bounds of normal care. His every move in the house was monitored. If he went into the bathroom or locked himself in a room, his grandmother reacted painfully. She demanded open doors, explaining this as concern, but in fact deprived him of personal space. The teenager lived in conditions of constant surveillance when even simple everyday actions could not remain private. Over time, her touches ceased to be a manifestation of normal family closeness. At first, they were hugs that lasted too long, then persistent caresses accompanied by strange emotional outbursts. For the teenager, this became increasingly frightening and humiliating. He had no way to push her away or complain to anyone. He had no trusted people outside the home. The neighbors continued to consider this family closed, but outwardly prosperous. No one saw any signs of conflict. The woman remained friendly during meetings and knew how to keep up a conversation. But at home, something different was happening. Her emotional outbursts became regular. If her grandson tried to show independence, she went from accusations to tears, from tears to sharp outbursts of aggression. Over time, new, more disturbing manifestations were added to this. She could force him to sit next to her for hours, explaining that it was calmer this way. She held his hand, stroked his hair, while her facial expression resembled a state not of care, but of obsession. Gradually, the teenager began to feel that his body was no longer his alone. Psychologically, this created a deep internal conflict in him. On the one hand, he understood that what was happening was abnormal. On the other, he saw no way out. Any resistance caused a violent reaction. She could threaten to harm herself if he pushed her away. These forms of emotional pressure tied him even more tightly, turning his life into a vicious circle. Research into such cases shows that at this stage, the victim loses the ability to adequately assess the situation. Constant control and lack of external support create a feeling of hopelessness. The teenager lived in exactly this state. He learned to mechanically fulfill demands in order to avoid scandals. An important factor was that his grandmother effectively isolated him from the education and medical systems. He showed up at school irregularly, and when he did, he seemed withdrawn and depressed. The teachers attributed this to the consequences of the tragedy with his parents and did not report any alarm signals. Medical examinations were also carried out formally. His grandmother accompanied him and answered all the doctor's questions. Meanwhile, her behavior became increasingly sexualized. At first, this manifested itself in conversations that touched on topics that were inappropriate within the framework of the guardian-teenager relationship. She would force physical intimacy on him under the pretext that this way he will feel needed. For the teenager, this meant a complete loss of boundaries. The psychological pressure was accompanied by coercion. At a certain point, he found himself in a situation where he could no longer resist. Her obsession took the form of direct control over his body. Later, the case materials indicated that the teenager was effectively deprived of choice, and the relationship acquired a character that experts classified as violent. To an outside observer, the house remained quiet and calm. None of the neighbors heard screams or quarrels, but inside, tension was building, gradually leading both to a tragic outcome. The teenager, deprived of freedom and normal social connections, lived in a state of constant psychological and physical pressure. The grandmother sank deeper and deeper into her addiction, losing the ability to separate reality from obsessive desires. By this time, her life had become completely focused on her grandson. She did not work, almost never left the house, and her contacts with the outside world were limited to rare trips to the store. All her thoughts and actions were concentrated on him. She created an atmosphere of isolation around herself and him, which became increasingly dense. This period became a turning point. It was then that the grandson finally lost the sense of control over his own life. The grandmother ceased to be a guardian. She turned into a source of threat and fear. Their coexistence became a process of slow destruction from which there was no escape. After her grandson's complete submission, her behavior became even more destructive. She no longer hid her obsession. Every day was structured so that he was nearby. Any attempt to distance himself was perceived as a threat. If he was alone in the room, she would knock on the door, demanding that he open it. If he lingered in the bathroom for more than a few minutes, she suspected him of deception. Psychological pressure was combined with direct restrictions. She would take away his phone, not hide his clothes, not allow him to leave the house. In rare cases, when he tried to defend his right to personal space, this led to violent emotional breakdowns on her part. She cried, screamed, accused him of ruining her life. The grandson found himself in a position of complete dependence. All his needs were controlled and regulated by her. Financially, he was completely deprived of independence, as he had no access to a bank account or earnings. His school performance declined completely. An atmosphere was formed within the family in which there was no future. A particularly difficult element was her outbursts of sexualized obsession. This no longer seemed accidental or a misunderstanding. She systematically sought physical intimacy and interpreted any attempts at resistance as an insult. The teenager's internal resistance was replaced by apathy. He carried out her demands mechanically in order to avoid conflicts and threats. This situation began to affect his mental state. Witnesses later described him as distant, with a vacant look in his eyes. At school, he almost stopped communicating with his peers, and the rare contacts were of a formal nature. Teachers noted signs of depression, but associated them exclusively with the loss of his parents. No one imagined the scale of what was happening at home. Meanwhile, the grandmother was deepening her dependence. She no longer saw him as a grandson. For her, he was a figure wholly owned by her. She could spend hours sitting next to him, not saying a word, just watching. This behavior gave the impression of a person who had lost touch with reality. The situation was made worse by the lack of outside intervention. Relatives who might have noticed warning signs rarely showed up at the house. Neighbors had no idea what was going on. Child welfare services relied on official reports that the family appeared stable. The teenager was left alone with a pathology from which there was no way out. Attempts to resist only led to increased pressure. Internal tension grew. His life turned into a constant expectation of the next attack of obsession or outburst of aggression. As the months passed, the crisis point became closer. Grandma finally lost the ability to separate her own desires from reality. She stopped hiding her demands, stopped taking into account his age and psychological state. For her, there was only one condition: he must be there, always and completely. The home that had once seemed safe was becoming a closed space of silence, control, and oppression. It was not a home, but a place where two lives were slowly being destroyed, one under the weight of addiction, the other under the weight of hopelessness. The tragedy unfolded on an ordinary evening, no different from the previous ones. Neighbors recalled that there was no noise in the house. No one saw signs of conflict, but inside, the tension reached its limit. The teenager, who was under constant pressure, could not stand it any longer. Later, experts established that events had developed rapidly. In the kitchen, there was another surge of obsessive demands from his grandmother. She did not hide her addiction, and his refusal to fulfill her will was accompanied by threats and hysteria. For him, this was the moment when the situation seemed hopeless. The teenager had a heavy object in his hands. The blow landed right on the head. In a short time, the grandmother received several wounds incompatible with life. Blood quickly flooded the kitchen floor, leaving a picture that would later become the main evidence in the case. After that, he made no attempt to hide what he had done. He remained in the house next to the body. When neighbors noticed the lack of usual activity and called the police, the picture was unambiguous. The teenager was sitting motionless. His hands and clothes were covered in blood. He did not resist arrest. The investigation showed that the murder was not pre-planned. Investigators recorded a picture of accumulated stress and mental pressure. Psychiatric experts pointed to the victim's condition, deprived of choice, and finding himself in conditions of total isolation. Searches and interrogations confirmed the long-term nature of the pathological addiction. Diary entries by the grandmother were found in the house, recording her obsessive thoughts and confessions that life has no meaning without him. These documents became key evidence in classifying her behavior as a form of violence. The court documents documented the complexity of the case. On the one hand, the teenager committed murder. On the other, his life for a long time was a series of psychological and physical restrictions imposed by an adult guardian. During the trial, experts described how the situation could not have remained unnoticed if there had been control from social services or relatives. But the lack of intervention allowed the pathology to develop to a critical stage. The teenager was found guilty, but his age and the conditions he was in were mitigating circumstances. The court ordered his placement in a specialized juvenile facility. The woman's death and subsequent investigation were a resonant event for the town. To neighbors, it looked like a sudden tragedy in a home that had always seemed prosperous. To experts, it was an example of how hidden forms of addiction can lead to catastrophic consequences. The story ended at the moment when only blood, ruined lives, and investigators' reports remained in the house.